Door County Environmental Council Summer Program. I'm so happy you could be with us. My name is Steve Etaw. I'm the president of the Door County Environmental Council and a member of the board of directors, and I'm just so pleased to have you all here. We have for you tonight an excellent program with an outstanding speaker, and we will get to him fairly shortly, but in the interim you're going to have to put up with me for a little bit here. It won't be long. Sometimes people say to me, what is it that Door County Environmental Council does? And I want to just briefly tell you what we do and kind of what we stand for. We're really an environmental advocacy group. That's the best explanation for us. How does that differentiate us from any other environmental group? I think it's because we speak out on issues that are important, both positively and negatively. We're not against anyone, we're for the environment. That's what I always say. This year, we've been very busy. We've had some great programs. We had a program earlier this year on shoreland zoning. Shoreland zoning has had a substantial effect. The changes have had an effect on Door County, and we had Mariah Good from the Planning Department speak. Subsequent to that, we had a program on sustainable farming where we actually took bus tours out to farms with full buses of people and saw sustainable farming in practice and found out where the produce can, why it's better for you, and so on. We're also going to have an additional program this fall. We call it the Dark Skies program. It's on light pollution. I hope you will all come to that. Should be over the course of a couple days. We're still firming up the plans on that. But basically preserving the darkness, if you will, in Door County, and why that's important to wildlife and why that's important to all of us. We also support at DCEC a very active Facebook page, and if you're not on our Facebook page, please avail yourself of that. And we've got various people here, Mike Barkey, who will follow me, and back here we've got Leslie Bowden. If you say, well, how do I get onto your Facebook page? How do I do this? I'm not familiar with it. Please see one of them, and we'll be happy to get you started. And I think once you get started, you'll see a lot of great articles on Facebook that are very timely, happened yesterday. We also have a website that we try to keep current, and we do a quarterly newsletter that contains great articles primarily written by our board of directors. In addition, the Door County Environmental Council takes stands at village, town, county meetings. We take positions on environmental aspects, positions, primarily pro-environment, and establish a dialogue with our elected officials. We recently, in the spring, took such a position at a DNR hearing relative to a large expansion of a CAFO in Forestville from around 6,000 animals to 10,000 animals. And you're going to hear more this evening about big ag and, unfortunately, pollution that comes from big ag. The DNR, we had well over 100 people attended this meeting in Forestville. The DNR has yet never refused an expansion of a CAFO ever, and didn't turn this one down either, approved it. Why is this significant to Door County? As you know, we've got very shallow soil here. Door County was glaciated, and we're left with much beauty and much wonderful natural resources, but we weren't left with a whole lot of soil. Well, okay, how is that significant? Well, we've got very little filtration. Also, underneath that soil is rock, primarily called karst rock, which is fractured rock, got a lot of cracks and fissures in it. So when pollution or anything gets into it, water, it moves through the soil relatively rapidly, moves through the karst rock relatively rapidly, ends up both in our aquifer and in our bay, lakes, streams, etc. A cow, it seems, produces 18 times the waste of a human being. They're not 18 times as large, but they produce 18 times the waste. Well, okay, so if we have a new CAFL of 10,000 animals, it's the equivalent of a city with 180,000 people in it. That's roughly the size of Green Bay proper. Well, okay, roughly the size of Green Bay proper, but it doesn't have any sewage treatment system. So if we had a city of 180,000 human beings and the waste was merely spread on the ground, what environmental impact would that have? I think it would be significant. That's what we have happening, unfortunately. The pollution that we're seeing is not only coming from animals. It comes from other sources as well, as the farm rights people are quick to point out. And they're absolutely correct. It comes from metropolitan sewage districts. It comes from homeowners with faulty septic systems. Comes from improper use of fertilizers. And so by no means is big ag and big ag CAFOs the only source of pollution. I say it's one of the main sources of pollution, not the only. And we need to address all of them. So I'm not just targeting CAFOs. We recently had a study done in Kewaunee. It's actually funded in part by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And two very well-respected scientists, Mark Borchert, a microbiologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Maureen Muldoon, a geology professor and expert on the hydrogeology of Door County. They did in-depth study testing 621 wells, a good sample size. They have come out with preliminary results which are nothing short of shocking. The complete results have not been released. Their complete study will be released later this year, but it should stun all of us. Approximately a third of the wells in Kewaunee County are compromised, I say polluted, to the extent that they do not have water that's fit to be drunk by human beings. That's serious. All three rivers in Kewaunee, by the Environmental Protection Agency, state they are impaired. What does that impaired mean? I say that's a fancy word for polluted. We're experiencing dead zones. Zones, what's a dead zone? A dead zone is a area in the lake or bay that can't support any life because it doesn't have oxygen. Believe it or not, you think fish need water, they really need oxygen in the water to exist. And you say, well, okay, that's Kewaunee County. They got a whole lot of cows there and whatever they're doing. That's not coming here. That's not going to come to Door County. That's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it's happening. It is coming to Door County, and it is happening. And I believe that we can do something about it, but it's an uphill battle. There is big money behind big ag. And people say, well, we can't possibly contest things that big ag wants to do because they've got hundreds of millions or billions of dollars behind them, and what can we do? This country is run on money, is what I hear. Well, we've got more money than they've got because we're something that they need. We're the consumer. What if we as a consumer said, you know what, I'm not going to buy this product. I'm not going to consume it. You're polluting our waters. We're just not going to, we're going to stop consuming it till you stop doing that. Well, can that happen? Can the consumer get excited and involved and do that? Hopefully they can, and hopefully we do that before it's too late. Because of the depth, it's quite likely that the Bay of Green Bay will pollute and be contaminated, or more contaminated, if you will, sooner than the lake because of its size. So it's of great concern. I just want you to take a minute and think about what would happen to Door County if all the waters around Door County, I'm talking all the way down the bay side, through the Death Store, all the way up the lakeside, and past Sturgeon Bay, of course, to the edge of Door County, into the Bay of Sturgeon Bay. What if all of that was polluted? What do you mean polluted? Well, I mean unswimmable. You couldn't swim in it. basically no fish in it, probably blue-green algae floating in it and on the beach and smelly. Just think about that. What would it do to Door County? What would it do to its tourism economy? What would it do to people that live here? What would it do to property values? And last but not least, what would it do to the environment? Door County is unique. We have all kinds of interesting plants that are found nowhere else in the world. So this is vital stuff, and I'm going to stop with that because I'm out of information and out of expertise, but I want you to think about that, if you will. We have a speaker tonight that's not out of information and he's not out of expertise. I'm going to turn the program over now to Mike Barkey, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Barkey. I'm the Vice President of the Door County Environmental Council and also a board member. And if I can just put in a commercial here, I guess, for about 15 seconds. If you would please mute your cell phones so we don't have any interruptions. Also, we have a Door County Environmental Council booth on the side if you're seeking additional information about DCEC. And we do have refreshments in the back as well. And I'm sure there will be a question and answer period after, and we'll have somebody with a microphone and we'll organize that so that we have a little bit of control, I guess, over people wanting to ask some questions, seeking some answers. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Cam Davis. Cam Davis is an author, lawyer, small business owner, political strategist, conservationist, volunteer, husband, and dad. For 2 terms, Cam served as President Barack Obama's Great Lakes Czar. In that capacity, he was the administration's liaison to Congress and coordinated 11 federal departments, including the White House Council on Environmental Quality, Departments of Interior, Homeland Security, Agriculture, Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and others, implementing the largest Great Lakes-centric investment in U.S. history. Before that, he was president and CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, and litigating attorney. He started his career as a volunteer. This year, he has won honors for his Great Lakes work over 3 decades from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Great Lakes Advisory Board, and the Michigan Area of Concern Conference. And he is also 60,000 words into writing a new book about the fight to save the Great Lakes. After publishing his book, Confluence, using a family watershed concept covering his ancestors' service in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, encounters with Abraham Lincoln, and even Bugs Malone's Northsiders in Prohibition-era Chicago, Cam discovered another passion, helping families tell their stories. This year he has founded Genoir, am I pronouncing that correctly? All right. With one simple philosophy, that biographies shouldn't be reserved only for billionaires, generals, and celebrities. Epic stories should be told about everyday people. After leaving the Obama administration on its final day, Cam joined GEI Consultants as vice president. Today he is most proud of being a dad, husband, and neighbor. He lives with his family in the restored home his great-grandparents bought in Evanston in 1928. You can visit him online at www.genoir, it's GENOIR.com. So without any further comment, I'll turn it over to Cam Davis.
Good, thank you, everybody. I think this is working. I can hear myself, which sometimes doesn't happen. Sometimes it happens too much. So it seems to be working. I really want to say thank you for turning out tonight. I know I've got some very good friends in the audience like Penny Ann Roth and George and Judy Harmon. I feel like it's a homecoming. And thank you very, very much to the Door County Environmental Council. I cannot tell you, having just come from federal service for the past 8 years, how important it is to have voices, organizational voices, representing hundreds of people in communities around the Great Lakes in order to make the job of saving the Great Lakes easier. It's hard enough as it is, but it would be a whole lot harder without organizations like the Council. And thanks for everything that you all do in your daily lives. It makes a big, big difference. Look, I know we're all working overtime to save the environment that we care about, and especially the lakes that we love, in the face of what seems like a relentless uphill battle. But I've got good news. The secret recipe for protecting the Great Lakes, it's a secret recipe that even Washington can't ignore, is out there. And Mike has asked me to come and speak to you and at last, long, long last, reveal the secret recipe for saving the Great Lakes. Generations have searched for the secret recipe. People have been willing to pay vast sums for this secret strategy. But today I'm going to pull back the shroud so that the secret to protecting the Great Lakes is here for all of you to know and to use. But I cannot reveal the secret strategy just yet. But I want to tell you a story. But first, it's on. I just got to hold it up closer. There you go. But I want to tell you a story first. And it's a story about a regional hero from this area, this region in the 1800s, that had some lessons that I think all of us can live by today. It was September of 1881, that time of year when the sky grows darker a little bit earlier. The wind kicked up bigger and bigger waves on the Great Lakes. And Stephen Forbes was out on Lake Michigan with a small crew. He was trolling the lake from the coast of Chicago's South Side Hyde Park neighborhood up through Evanston toward the Wisconsin border. And as the sky grew darker, nice effect, by the way, turning out the lights, in anticipation of even more unpredictable weather, Forbes headed back to Chicago with his catch, where, with some trepidation, he pulled up to the city's docks at Streeterville, near where Navy Pier stands today. Now, Streeterville was not the kind of place that you ever wanted to go, let alone at night. Things like gambling, prostitution, and murder were rampant in Streeterville. It was a neighborhood that was kind of the precursor to the days of Al Capone that would follow decades later. In fact, this first guy in the picture was Captain Streeter, after whom Streeterville was named. You do not want to tangle with this guy. He opened saloons and all kinds of things out in that area that I mentioned before. And that's what it used to look like. That was his first shack out by where Navy Pier stands today. Still, Forbes didn't have much of a choice for docking his boat. He'd been warned about Streeterville ahead of time, so he unfolded his knife and put it in an open position in his pocket, ready for anything. Fortunately for Forbes, Streeterville was uncharacteristically quiet that night. He and his crew made it to their destination with their catch and without incident. Stephen A. Forbes was no ordinary fisherman. He was what was then called an economic biologist, working the waters to get a sense of fish population levels, population distribution, and food sources. A few years earlier, in 1875, as curator of the Natural History Museum at what was once Normal University in Illinois, Forbes began collecting freshwater fish species. He focused on Lake Michigan and the Illinois River, his work beginning to inform people about how Chicago's sewage overflows flowing downstream towards the Mississippi River was affecting those downstream areas. Forbes was born during a turbulent time. And this is part of why I want to tell you this story, because we're living in a turbulent time. In 1844, in a part of north central Illinois that had recently seen the after effects of the Black Hawk War. And about a decade later, the nation was increasingly sliding into massive divisions over slavery. Barely in his teens, Forbes read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin about the plight of slaves. The book may have prompted Forbes to attend Freeport, Illinois' debate in 1858 between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, then vying for a Senate seat. At the debate, Lincoln and Douglas parried over the dominating issue of the day, slavery. Lincoln opened the debate, impressing the 14-year-old Forbes as virtuous with his stance against that unjust institution. When it was time for rebuttal, Douglas grew more aggressive, criticizing his opponents for their stance against slavery. The crowd in Freeport grew more and more raucous every time Douglas criticized slavery's opponents. And at one point, Douglas pointed out that when Lincoln spoke, Democrats didn't interrupt him. Unable to hold back, young Forbes shouted out from the crowd that maybe that was because Lincoln didn't take the offensive position of being for slavery. Though adults around him told the boy to stay in his place, Lincoln himself seemed to vindicate Forbes by commenting that Democrats treated Lincoln courteously not because they agreed with him, but because he, Lincoln, treated Democrats as gentlemen should be treated, which brought cheers from the audience. There was a strong commitment to education in Forbes' family, so the 14-year-old entered Beloit College some 30 miles to the north over the border in Wisconsin, and there he showed strong signs of being a philosopher. He penned an essay titled "Do Noble Things" and argued that every person is drawn at some level by their nature to act with a sense of high ideals. I am trying to teach my 14-year-old son about similar things right now. So I am impressed when a 14-year-old boy is thinking about high ideals. It was this sense of virtue that probably led Forbes to enlist in the 7th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry Regiment for the state of Illinois when he was 17 years old, as divisions over slavery broke into the open, pitting North against South. His service led him on a tour of duty into Tennessee. And from there, he and his unit rode further into the South, advancing past Corinth, Mississippi, to figure out the whereabouts of their enemy. Forbes, now deep into Confederate territory, carried an important dispatch that he was to deliver to a Union cavalry outpost. The dirt roads over which he rode were twisty and uncertain. Then, from seemingly nowhere, a cloud of Confederates swarmed Forbes. With no way out, and seeing his predicament, the Federal cavalryman shredded his dispatch and hid its fragments in his gun's holster. Forbes was taken to be interrogated by one of the Confederacy's most infamous generals, Pierre Beauregard. Some of you may remember that name, as he was the subject of a statute that was just taken down in New Orleans earlier this year. From there, he was sent to a southern prison outside of Macon, Georgia, where not long afterward, he contracted malaria and sank into a deep depression about the horrific conditions inside the prison. Forbes later recovered and was traded back to rejoin his unit in time to participate in a raid that laid the groundwork for the Union taking Vicksburg, Mississippi, the next year. And that, in turn, made a name for Ulysses Grant, helped the Union reclaim the Mississippi River, and ultimately win the war. But in some ways, Forbes was still a prisoner. His time in Georgia, witnessing extreme inhumanity, weighted by his own depression, impacted him profoundly. He reflected later in life that through the stupor of malaria, he observed that the relationship among fellow prisoners was vital to their survival. The fate of one prisoner relied on the fate of others, and vice versa. The key to survival was the strength of these interpersonal linkages. Now, fast forward about 20 years, around the time Forbes was trolling Lake Michigan's waters. At a time when most naturalists simply counted, collected, and classified organisms, he was casting for more, trying to understand how certain fish were associated with their prey and their predators. His work led him to head the Illinois State Natural History Survey, serve as state entomologist, and ultimately chair the University of Illinois' entomology department. Though he did not know it then, he was in the process of founding the field of ecology in North America to understand biological linkages. More than a decade after the war's end, in 1878, Forbes looked to help in terms of exploring how insects ate what they ate to help farmers, and his exploration would develop into the early field of integrated pest management. The balance of nature, Forbes wrote, should be disturbed only after full knowledge and searching reflections will be evident to anyone who realizes the complicated relations of living things and the consequent numerous and remote results of any changes in these relations. What the heck does that mean? Here's the translation. Forbes was arguing for thinking before acting so as to not harm biological integrity. Forbes wrote only a few months before his foray into trolling Lake Michigan's waters and docking in Streeterville in 1881 that the scientist must be able to cross boundaries between specialties and link one thing to another. I want you to remember this statement. To be able to move across boundaries, to link one thing to another. That the scientist's specialty is in the vital relations of the various organic groups and the interactions of organisms. In 1887, he delivered remarks to the Peoria Scientific Association called The Lake as a Microcosm. He reconstituted and delivered these remarks at a commencement speech at Indiana University 130 years ago, marshaling the evidence that he had gathered from his work on Lake Mendota here in Wisconsin and Lakes Michigan and Superior, among others, to argue that whatever affects any species in an ecosystem complex must speedily have its influence of some sort upon the whole assemblage. What did he mean? As much as the importance about relationships began to form in his mind during his Civil War prison experience, Forbes was advocating that we look at vital linkages, look at outside influences to understand how it is making an impact. Vital comes from vitalis, Latin for of or belonging to life, and Forbes was proselytizing about the connections among living things for the fundamentals of life to function. It wasn't just about understanding science, it was about acting on science. We can only rest satisfied, he said, when the conditions of life for our people have actually improved. And of course, Forbes wasn't alone thinking about the integration of life systems or thinking before acting. Others studying the lakes and from the region complemented his work, like Victor Shelford of the University of Illinois and Henry Chandler Coles of the University of Chicago, who used the dunes at the southern end of Lake Michigan as his subject. And of course, Aldo Leopold about a half century later, all from our region, the Great Lakes region. So there's the story that I wanted to tell you. And believe me, I wasn't just asking you to sit through a fun story. There's a point to all of this. Forbes lived in times of tremendous social and political upheaval, just like we are today. But he pointed to the secret recipe I said I'd reveal, and that is, we have to forge new and sustained vital relations with seemingly disparate stakeholders, something that the council is trying to do. We have to be prevention-oriented. It's the only way we can keep from forever being behind the eight ball. And third, we have to understand outside influences that can make our already tough jobs harder, or easier for that matter. And here's what I mean. Linkages among various political, economic, and social dynamics, among others, are increasingly playing a role, I'd argue the largest role, in the fate of the lakes that we all love. We need to understand these linkages so that we can proactively prevent harm to public and ecological health. A century ago, our look at vital relations was mostly about probing biological linkages between individual species or plant communities or predator-prey relationships. Today, if we want to shape the ecosystem and public health, to improve the lives, our own lives, as Forbes would have argued, we have to look beyond biological, chemical, and physical linkages. in addition to those, we have to look at and anticipate political, economic, financial, technological, informational, and even changes in the media as they may affect the Great Lakes. So let's take a look at a few of just those. On the economic side, one thing to watch, and you've heard a little bit about this already tonight, is economic trends, especially as they relate to agricultural changes. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, agriculture in this region has been experiencing a downturn since 2014, with little sign of abatement. Households with small farm income relied on off-farm income to get by, whereas large farm operations relied on agriculture for most of their income. Agricultural debt is rising in many quarters. Michigan and Wisconsin had the highest rates of bankruptcies per 10,000 farms, whereas Iowa had the lowest within the Chicago Fed region. And the forces that otherwise buffer against these trends to help producers are otherwise uncertain. For example, shifts in trade policy, something that we continue to hear about in the news from the Trump administration. Prospects for stronger subsidies through water quality, conservation, food safety support, crop and livestock disease prevention, and agricultural risk coverage under the Farm Bill are due for renewal next year in what is otherwise an unpredictable legislative climate. What could all this mean for the Great Lakes? First, we should expect to see more consolidation from small farms to larger operations, whose owners may or may not appreciate the importance of water quality and biological diversity the way that we as Great Lakes residents do. Second, depending on changes in agricultural property values, it could mean that incentives such as tax deductions could increase for producers to place marginal lands in conservation easements along stream sides and other riparian areas. It also means that we have to be on the lookout for these dynamics, that they could increase pressure on farmers to farm in marginal areas as well. The point is, these economic linkages to ecosystem health are real, and they deserve our forethought so that we can anticipate and act on them. Another area for a lot of changes is informational, and this is a good area, I think. Regardless of which issue you're concerned about, whether it's agriculture and its impacts on the environment, or air pollution, understanding these kinds of connections requires adequate information tools. We all need this in our daily lives. What if we could have a dashboard that allows us to pool information so that we can forecast changing links and dynamics like agricultural economic conditions in the Great Lakes region? What if? Look, we can forecast the weather. Sometimes unfortunately, but we can forecast the weather. We can also forecast economic conditions too. For example, national economic indicators showed consumer sales, sales of cars and light trucks, household net worth, and some sales, home sales, trailing off in 2006 through 2007 and heading into the 2008 recession. If we had these indicators for the economy, what if we had the tools in place to help us forecast changes in landscapes, water quality, invasive species? The idea really isn't that far off. In fact, some of it is already beginning to happen today. For example, and this is a little known example, I've been surprised at how there's really been no media coverage of this. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their risk assessment work culminated in a look at the top species that could enter the Great Lakes from outside the U.S. under certain conditions. This kind of risk forecasting, coupled with the service's regulatory efforts, resulted in 11 alien species being peremptorily blocked from entering the United States. This is a big deal, and it made no news. And it's the best of the best, because forecasting based on looking at linkages in biology, global commerce patterns, and climate trends, among other things, were done all so that action could be taken before the damage could be done. In short, another trend will be aggregating information within these linkages so that We can connect the dots and make more prevention-oriented choices. An information system that's accessible by the Great Lakes community, that's us, has even more power than just helping everyone anticipate and prevent problems. Its beneficiaries include, for example, businesses, which depend on lowering risk and uncertainty in their supply chains and their operations, on government agencies that often need lots of lead time, I know, before they can act, citizens who want to understand trends in the Great Lakes and therefore their health to inform those decisions, and researchers working to fathom even more drivers for ecosystem stress. Fortunately, experts are working on these kinds of information systems already. The Great Lakes Commission and the Nature Conservancy, for example, are working on a blue accounting system to help track progress under our region's collective ecological, economic, and social goals. Really, really important. But what about the linkage between Great Lakes health and funding? Now, this is an easy one. Funding is the currency that allows all of us to be able to understand and act. There's rarely been a day that goes by since I left the administration when I'm not asked, well, what will happen to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative? That's the funding program that Mike mentioned at the outset in the introduction. Well, as we all, I think, know by now, the Trump White House proposed in May of FY18 a budget that zeroed out or eliminated the GLRI, the Restoration Initiative, taking it from $300 million a year to zero. It was a grave affront to the very states that swung the election. But before leaving the Obama administration, I was confident that the GLRI would survive, and I'm confident today. And that is because we have collectively built an incredibly strong bipartisan wall around this program. But the GLRI isn't it's only as strong as agencies' base budgets are that can support it. And these are the budgets that support agency staff in administering programs like the GLRI to ensure that they're effective. If budget and staff cuts affect the agency as a whole, the agency may be in a position of considering using part of the GLRI to fund other efforts and programs. We don't want to see that. We want to see programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative directed at what? At that. We want to see those programs lasered in on restoring that. In other words, you can have a fully funded GLRI, but see the erosion of surrounding agency budgets, and the net effect is still the same. A severely compromised budget leads to a severely compromised ecosystem. Stephen Forbes would have argued that you can't just afford to be scientists or professors or researchers or lawyers like me. We all have to be budget advocates too. After all, budgets are not just numbers. They are a statement of our values. And that leads me to science. Whatever understanding we have and action we take can only happen if we're using the very best science. And today, there's no way to sugarcoat this. There is a war against science that's going on. And we have to fight hard to protect scientific integrity. For example, there are two bills right now in front of Congress that could jeopardize scientific integrity. The first would limit the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to consider some of the highest quality science available, including studies that inform EPA's national ambient air quality standards, like those for soot and smog, things that are important to us and our kids. If passed, this bill would discredit years of work by such minor league institutions as Harvard University and the American Cancer Society on health impacts from particulate matter. These studies not only support EPA's recent updates to national health standards for particulate matter, they're also critical to EPA's analysis of costs and benefits for several important recent air pollution rules, like the Mercury Air Toxics Standard and the Clean Power Plan. The bill is not about advancing scientific integrity. It's a blatant attempt to deny access to crucial studies that provide support for critical health protections for you and for me and the communities that we care about. I'm glad you're sitting down, because I'm going to give you the bill number. And what you do with this information is up to you. But the bill number is HR 1430, and the title of the bill, and this is what really gets me, the title of the bill is the Honest Act. It has passed the full House and is waiting on Senate action. The second bill, H.R. 1431, the Science Advisory Board Act of 2017, is the more honestly named of the two bills in that it is actually about the EPA's Science Advisory Board, but that's about where any legitimacy stops. H.R. 1431 would change EPA's Science Advisory Board's peer review process to unfairly limit participation by qualified scientific experts, slant the balance of interests reflected in the board, and create a significant disincentive for researchers to support advances that protect people from harmful pollutants. This bill, if passed, would significantly weaken EPA's ability and credibility in protecting public health, your grandchildren's health, your lake's health. This is happening in addition to news that the agency leadership isn't waiting for these bills to pass. It is also undermining other scientific integrity efforts within the agency. H.R. 1431 has also passed the full House and is waiting on Senate action. So in rolling up here, if there's nothing else you take away from tonight, it's that the vital relations between science and land use, economics, politics, and many more forces than I'm able to cover here have a tremendous impact on the fate of the Great Lakes. And the vital relations are not just between these disciplines, they're between you and elected officials and reporters and farmers. And as Forbes admonished, we have to cross boundaries to be citizens in addition to our day jobs if we want the lakes to be healthy. We need to act on the connections between what we do for a living and what we live to do. We, all of us, represent a very proud region. We come from the region of Forbes and of Leopold. We come from the region where Rachel Carson studied the famed robins of Michigan State University's campus in East Lansing for Silent Spring. And if the rise of nationalism in this country is something to be concerned about, then the rise of regionalism is also a force to be reckoned with. And I think the Great Lakes region is such a region. In an age when people retreat into their own circles and mostly listen to those who agree with them, organizations like the Council are talking to and listening to farmers and vice versa. Incredibly important. And honestly, you're out in front on this, whereas many others don't have these kinds of relationships that they've even begun to form. In our region, we strengthen vital relations among disciplines, not weaken them. We're scientists and voters. We're not one or the other. We're lawyers and voters, not one or the other. We're policymakers and advocates and voters, not just one or the other. We're moms, we're dads, we're neighbors, and we're voters, not just one or the other. In our region, we don't tolerate scientific bullying. In our region, we believe that bipartisanship can still exist, and the work that has been done on programs like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative are proof positive that bipartisanship can exist. In our region, we listen to and we collaborate with one another. And in our region, we stand up for the protection of water because our lives and our livelihoods depend on it. Thank you very much for listening.
Wayne Kudik from Fish Creek. I'm with the Climate Change Coalition of Door County and Celebrate Earth Week, which is coming back to you between April 22nd and 29th to honor Governor Nelson's creation of Earth Day. Question about Foxconn.
I'm sorry, about what?
Foxconn, they're going to put in production plants down south, apparently.
Yep.
It seems like the legislative process is shooting then aiming. Not thinking and making decisions. Another concern I have, I've read that that plant will use 15.2 million gallons of water a day, more than the whole city of Racine, and they're being exempted from environmental in our case, Department of Natural Resources, regulations about stream controls and water usage and standards about returning cleaned water that apparently is in the violation of the Great Lakes Act. You got some comments on that?
Sure. Well, I won't be philosophical about it. One thing that I think organizations can take a look at is something called the anti-degradation policy. We have under the Clean Water Act, anti-degradation is a fancy word for you can't make it worse. Sometimes get, not so much of a close look. And that is something that has been used time and time again with a great deal of success.
What's the future, the prediction about the survivability of the Clean Water Act?
Yeah. So the question was, I'm done with the mic, just so you know. What's the future of the Clean Water Act? I lived through and was part of the effort to save the Clean Water Act in 1994 when the contract with America, some of you remember those days, part of that contract was to try to chip away at the Clean Water Act, which to me is one of those inalienable fundamental laws for us in this country to protect our health. And they weren't able to undo the Clean Water Act during that time. There was just too much opposition. I wouldn't say it was at the level of public outcry that we've seen with the ACA, for example, the Affordable Care Act, but there was an outcry when Congress tried to undo the Clean Water Act more than 20 years ago. I anticipate that we would see the very same thing and hope from groups like the Council, and know from the groups like the Council and many, many others, especially around this region. The thing I'll also add to that is you're never going to guess in a million years which region helped to lead that charge to push back against those efforts to undo the Clean Water Act. Anybody? I don't have $1 million for a reward or anything like that if you get the answer right, but somebody take a shot at it.
Midwest.
Midwest? The Midwest, that's right. The Great Lakes region. Why? Because we have 95% of the nation's fresh surface water, right here. 95%. We've got 84% of North America's fresh surface water. We have 20% of the Earth's fresh surface water supply. We are the water region. And when you mess with things like the Clean Water Act, this is the region that goes to Washington and fights really hard to protect those key statutes. And it will do that again. Yes, please. And just introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
My name is Steve Anderson. I'm a trustee of the Nature Conservancy. My wife and I have been involved in the Great Lakes Initiative of the Conservancy. We met last year in Buffalo, New York, and out of that meeting came an idea on linkages that raises this question. It's important for us to be individually proactive in protecting our Great Lakes, but the leverage comes from national organizations and local organizations working together and coordinating their efforts. I think there are 6 to 8 national organizations working on Great Lakes initiatives. From your perspective, are they coordinating? Are they leveraging their capacity to make change through their working with one another? You bring a unique perspective, I think, to that question.
Good, thank you, Steve. So the question was, are many of the organizations on the national level and many others coordinated to help save the Great Lakes? And the answer is yes. I mean, it's really a yes. I'm not even qualifying it by saying some of the time or most of the time. It's a yes. And they coordinate very closely through something called the Healing Our Waters Coalition, which was built about 10 years ago to do exactly this, to help promote a Great Lakes program and to take organizations like the Council, like the Alliance for the Great Lakes, like the National Wildlife Federation, and make sure that they're speaking with one unified voice. They did this because they were hearing from legislators in Congress, look, you've got everybody coming at us with all these different requests. It's really important that you prioritize and get us, one set of requests. So that's what they did. To me, the question isn't so much whether the environmental organizations are coordinated. I think they are. To me, it is, can we get other stakeholders involved in the effort? Can we get more business voices involved in helping to save the Great Lakes? And I think the answer is yes, and we're seeing some of this now. The Council of Great Lakes Industries out of Ann Arbor has been a terrific advocate for Great Lakes programs and sustainability around the region. We're seeing microbreweries organize around the Great Lakes. Craft beer makers organize because they understand that the #1 ingredient is what? Exactly. So, to me, it's not so much about the environmental groups. I think they're already strong, they're well organized, they're coordinated. It's helping to communicate to others why they may not see the direct impact that clean water has on them right away, but there is an impact, and they need to voice up to help because it's in their own self-interest to be just as organized as conservation groups are. Thanks for the question. Yes, Penny.
I'm wondering if manure is a big problem for water quality, and particularly if manure is a big problem for water quality, why aren't we doing more with biomass as a source of energy? I mean, if you turned it into energy, it'd be gone.
So why are we doing more with biomass if manure is such a big deal? And I think there is a fair amount of development going on to basically use manure as an energy source. You've heard of that term biodigesters. They are being used more and more frequently. So I think a lot of people are trying to move in that direction. Sometimes it can be a funding issue, and sometimes it can just be an issue of getting producers. This is what I learned in federal government. I always used to call them farmers, but then I was taught that you got to call them producers. Should, get to know what they are and learn about them more. And I think it's starting to happen.
They get money by generating their own energy.
Yeah. I think it's starting to happen. That's another area is the tech development side of things. There's a lot of tech development going on to help conserve water, to help return water at least in as good a shape as it was, taken out and used. And that's a frontier that is just under development, like you wouldn't believe. It seems like every city now has, in the Midwest, a water hub or a water technology incubator, whereas we really didn't have any about 10 years ago or so. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Joe Kramer. I'm a summer resident of Sister Bay and a full-time resident of Illinois. My question is about Asian carp in the Illinois River. I was looking into this deeply some years back, but I'm a little rusty. The Illinois DNR was, and I hope still is, actively netting just tons of Asian carp to keep the pressure down from them escaping into Lake Michigan. Do you know do you have any perspective on that? Are they still doing that, or is their funding threatened in what they're doing?
Thank you for the question. The question is Illinois still netting Asian carp in the Illinois River system to try to reduce population levels, to reduce the risk of Asian carp getting into Lake Michigan? And the answer is yes. Not only is it yes, but I think that that's actually one of the most effective tools that we have. In other parts of the world where Asian carp come from, those populations have actually been depleted because they've been netted out and they are consumed. I continue to think that we should use technology and engineering to help in the battle against silver and bighead carp in particular. But these fish actually have a value as pet food, as fertilizer, as a protein source. The second part of your question was about funding, and is the funding there? Well, the Illinois DNR relies about 100% on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to help with those fishing efforts. And had the effort or the attempt to zero out the GLRI been successful, Illinois, in its current budgetary state, would not have been able to keep up that fight with that netting. We would have seen then, I don't even know how many times increase in the risk to Lake Michigan would have happened from there. But budgets matter. That federal budget is paying for those state efforts. That's another reason why we got to have these federal budget programs until Illinois is able to turn those things around. I actually have a question for you, which is, why are any of you seasonal residents here and living in Illinois? I don't get it. That's reversed, I think. All right, next question. Yeah, we're here. We'll get the microphone up to you in a second. I'll get to you. I won't forget you.
My name is Marcus Ritter, and I went to one of those CAFO meetings where they had the guy from the U.S. Department of something or other. And anyway, he told us that there's no real need for distilled water anymore because the osmotic filters are just as good as. And so what do you say to a farmer who says to his neighbor that has polluted wells, why don't you just take this osmotic filter and install it and you'll be safe?
What's the attitude towards using osmotic filters to reduce farm runoff? Did I say? Okay. Part of my concern is in the size of the operations out there, and those are not cheap technologies to use. The larger these operations become, the more cost prohibitive it is to be able to use those technologies. And that, my concern is not about whether we have agriculture or not. Of course, we need that. But it's how big these operations are becoming. And you heard this, at the introduction. Local governments have a role to play here. One of the things that I think organizations and people can do is start to look at ordinances that can get out in front of these problems before they get too big. Because you can only fit so many head of cattle on an acre of land before you overwhelm the carrying capacity of that property. So, I think it's a good question. My concern is that, and I see this not just in the ag world, but in many others, technology can only get you so far. If you don't exercise and you don't eat right and you don't take care of yourself, yeah, you can go in and have surgery, but then you're trying to undo a problem, you're trying to fix a problem. You're not really trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. I think that's my concern. So we did have a question up here in front. If we have the microphone, I'm trying to be fair to people when they get their hands up insofar as I can put an order to this.
All right, does that work?
Yes, and introduce yourself.
I'm Carol Sills, formerly on the board of DCEC, and my question pertains to how the Great Lakes powers that be can influence mining. For instance, this thing, the Menominee River, is threatened with the, you're familiar with it, I'm sure.
At some level.
At some level.
Yeah.
So that's my question.
Yeah. So I think one of the key things that's really important whenever you're concerned about any issue is to realize who has the decision-making authority on that issue. And when it comes to mining, it's usually the state that has the authority. There is some backup that the feds can provide, but it's pretty thin. I know when we were at EPA, we looked very hard at how we could try to backstop against the further impact that mines would have in the North Country, and it was very difficult for us to do. It's those state laws and the state authorities that really are in the driver's seat on the mining issue. So it looks like she wants to ask a follow-up. And I'll do the best I can.
All right, are we concerned with two states here, both Wisconsin
Sure.
and Michigan?
Minnesota, don't forget about
Michigan.
Minnesota. as
Oh,
well.
and Minnesota.
Yeah, sure, there's
Right.
mining going on in Minnesota
I
as
know,
well,
but
so
I'm
it's
thinking
really-
in particular of the one that will affect Green Bay.
And there's Canada, so you're talking about the
All over
Menominee,
the-
the
yeah.
back 40.
Yeah, the back
Yeah.
40.
Sure, yeah, and all of them have a lot in common as well. Anyway, the states are in the driver's seat on those things. There is Canada, don't forget Canada has a lot of mining as well. There's something called the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the U.S. and Canada, and it doesn't really have the kind of force of being able to use it in a court of law, but it does have moral authority that can often be very effective as well. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is something I would look into.
Right, and the Native American tribes are very active.
Very, very
out
active.
front to
Yes.
protect the water.
One thing that we did do here is, and I'll try to, since I have the mic, one thing that we did try to do was provide funding to Native American tribes so that they could get the baseline science in place enough to know that if impacts were going to happen on water quality from mining, there at least would be the research that could be done, and we could capacitize the tribes to be able to have a voice in some of those discussions. Can I? Okay. All right. Yeah, thank you.
My name's Dave Price. I'm from Wilmette, Illinois. We've been in Jacksonport, Wisconsin. And my question is about the St. Lawrence Seaway, that many of the ocean freighters coming into the St. Lawrence Seaway fill up their hulls with water from the ocean and all kinds of invasive species. And now they come into Lake Michigan area and so forth and disperse all that water. What are we doing to control the ships that are coming through the St. Lawrence Seaway?
What are we doing to control invasive species that come in through ballast water tanks? Actually, there's been a lot of movement on that in the past several years. It used to be that that was the primary vector for invasive species getting into the Great Lakes. I'm not aware of any new invasive species that has come in through a ballast tank since probably 2006, 2007. Part of the reason for that is a practice that has been established called ballast water exchange. And that is where an ocean-going freighter gets out into the ocean, it dumps its ballast, pulls in salt water into its ballast tanks, and that basically kills a great deal of, but not all of, the organisms in the ballast tank. That ballast water exchange has been very, very effective. Has it been perfectly effective? No, it hasn't. So in addition to that, there has been an effort through the International Maritime Organization to now start to get baseline technology standards in place globally to deal with this problem of invasive species coming in through ballast tanks. What's really interesting about this, you're going to like this, is when EPA came up with rules, and the Coast Guard has its own rules on ballast tanks, a couple of years ago, we fought really hard to preserve that ballast water exchange within EPA's rules, in addition to the technology. We wanted, until the technology had been on board and proven effective for a long time, we wanted to preserve that ballast water exchange practice. And it was a really hard fight. And the fight hasn't ended. Right now, there's a bill in front of Congress to try to make uniform protections across the country for ballast water discharges. What's wrong with that? That's a good thing, right? Well, not necessarily. The Great Lakes are pretty different from the coasts in one small way. We don't have salt, so we have a very different ecology here than the coasts do. But I am concerned that some of the bills that are floating around in front of Congress, while they might do the good thing of harmonizing from authority to authority, and I think that is a good thing, they don't necessarily recognize the difference in ecosystems that I think that they need to. Wow, what happened? You guys are so shy at first, and now all of a sudden we're going to be here till 11 o'clock because you're not shy.
My name's Diana Hackbarth, and it's my husband David. We're all from Illinois. But I just was thinking about, in Illinois we have very many members of Congress who are Democrats who I think have some regard for the Great Lakes. But I guess I'm curious about the folks up here. We have a lot of Republicans. I guess my question is, what are their feelings? Since we all here have feelings for the Great Lakes and revere them and value them, how is the gang from here voting in Congress? Are they voting to deregulate all of this stuff? I guess I'm wondering, how could you live around here and not have the same feelings? But hey, I'm just asking.
Well, I'll try to answer the best I can. It kind of depends. My job was to work with these members, senators and actual congressmen and congresswomen, and I always felt very strongly that, look, if you are a parent taking your kid to the beach, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you want your kids to not be swallowing pathogens, from manure. If you drink water, How many of you drink water? Just you. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. All right. So I think that part of it has been about who's communicating to which members and in which ways. There's also been a great effort to try to help legislators understand how the Great Lakes are an economic driver for this region as well. It used to be that, we just talked about the environment. Well, now more and more data, research has come out showing that, in fact, the Great Lakes support a $7 billion sport fishery. Those are some big figures, and they get people's attention. So there's no way I can answer your question in a kind of one-size-fits-all way. I can tell you that when I would meet with Republican legislators, some would say, yes, I'm in favor of the Great Lakes, and yes, I will protect them, and some of them have done that. Some would say, look, I'm not against the Great Lakes, but this is just not a priority for me. I've had Democrats do the same thing, which is, yeah, I'm supportive, but it's not a priority for me. And I've had others that are out there in front championing. So I don't know, in this region anyway, that label makes a big difference. I don't even know if I'm answering your question because I can't get in the heads of individual voters. But I can tell you that from my experience in working with these legislators, and that's Republicans and Democrats, one thing that I heard, and this was without exception, was, look, if you, Cam, show me the results of the money that we are appropriating to you through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, I will continue to be supportive. That is almost an exact word-for-word quote from a Republican senator. So it makes a big difference.
So, okay, but I've done a lot of lobbying too. So you're suggesting that data changes people's minds. I'm having trouble believing that. I did
No.
20 years
I mean, for some, data can be influential, but what I am telling you is that personal stories from constituents, that makes all the difference in the world. You go into an office and you say these 5 magic words, this is important to me, and you're a constituent, that makes more difference than just about any data you can come up with. Thanks for the question.
My name's Buzz Enroth. I live over in Fish Creek. And I'm going to give what I'm not overseas, but full time, yes. And this is going to be. I'm going to give you a softball because that was a challenging question. No, I was interested in a little bit more about the Healing Our Waterways Coalition. Seems to me that an organization like that would be really in a strong position in terms of advocacy. And one of the thoughts I had was, you didn't mention anything about the tourism industry of the lakes. I'm kind of thinking that's got to be up in the top money makers. Sport fishing, $7 billion, part of that. Just wondering if they interface at all with the tourism, Chamber of Commerce, the sport fishing, all that kind of stuff. And also, the easy question is, I assume they have a web page and just Google it, right?
Yeah, Healing Our Waters, Great Lakes Coalition. Yeah, so Buzz, the answer to your question is, again, it depends. The Chambers of Commerce have been very supportive, and they've been pretty organized as well, with leadership out of the Detroit Chamber of Commerce. Other sectors, I haven't seen as much in terms of being organized. There might be individual hotels or individual hospitality units that have been supportive, but I don't see, for example, the Midwest Association of Hospitality Managers. There is no such thing, so don't Google that. I just made it up. I don't see any organization like that to help keep that sector organized. But again, I think part of it is just communicating, telling the story as to why that is important to them, because connecting those dots makes a big difference, and it's not really apparent to everybody. All right, and then I'll leave it to you to pass the mic back.
Jim Schwingle, we're weekend residents of Door County. Just out of curiosity, does the current administration have someone filling a position such as you had in the Obama administration?
So does the current administration have somebody who's coordinating the federal agencies. The answer is no, to something like, exactly like I did.
Behind you.
Hi, my name is Phil Hansotia. I'm a full-time resident of Ellison Bay. With as complex a situation as you describe, with the number of sources of support for the undercutting of the measures that you recommend, there has to be financing at the bottom of it all. So if you have a handle on the sources of funding for the efforts that are opposed to the recommendations that you're making, there could be public education and boycotting of goods and services that are generated by individuals who are causing the problem that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, you heard from Steve early on that you can vote with your dollars. I know I do. I think it's tremendously effective. The barrier is that, and you see a lot of this going on more and more in different contexts these days. The problem is that not everybody has the information about, how to buy and what to buy, what not to buy, things like that. So I think, part of the challenge there isn't so much that people aren't willing and want to do the right thing with their dollars. It may be more that there are not as many efforts out there to connect the dots for people. I see that as the barrier on that front. I mean, you just look at, somebody was asking me about BP. You look at what happened with BP in 2007 with its whiting facility. This was something that we worked on a lot at that time when I was at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I mean, people stopped going to BP to get their gas because of that. I mean, and that didn't, take any kind of information connection of the dots. That was just reading the media. But that was such a massive national news item. When you're talking about protecting the peninsula, against some kind of a local influence, you can't rely on the national media to pick that up and inform people. So I think that's the barrier.
Hi, my name's Kevin O'Neill, and I don't live here. And in fact, for those that do live here, we're leaving tomorrow. But I feel like being an environmentalist is going against the grain right now, that there's more forces against it than for it. And some of the people that I talk to who don't have the same opinion as I do say something like, well, the EPA really hasn't done anything, doesn't do anything, it just gets in the way of anything getting done. And I don't know how to respond to that. I'd like to have a few quick little stories or whatever I can fire back and say, well, this is what the EPA has done, this is what the government has done to protect us. And so don't assume it's just a roadblock to any sort of business progress.
So how do you respond to people when they say government gets in the way? One of my favorite examples of what the government does right, and there are many more examples of what it has done right than I think the opposite, especially when it comes to these matters, is you can ask them about their consumer confidence reports, CCR. A consumer confidence report is something that a municipal water supplier is required to put out to its ratepayers, people who consume water, if you're not on a private well, that shows what the levels of different pollutants are in that water supply. And it has to do that under law, that's government, and the EPA oversees those state and municipal efforts to put out those consumer confidence reports. I can tell you, every time I get one in the mail from Evanston, where we live, I look at it. There's nobody else that's doing that. You know, when you pick up a liter of bottled water or something like that at a gas station, there's no consumer confidence report that tells you how long that bottle has been sitting on the shelf. So maybe ask somebody if they've ever looked at their consumer confidence report. And that's just one example that comes to mind. And there are many others as well. Thank you. Great question. Never gotten that one before.
Cam, I may not have the name of the organization correct, but about 2 or 3 years ago, the Great Lakes Water Compact maybe was the name of it, of 2 countries, 7 or 8 states trying to protect the water in the Great Lakes and keep the water being used within the basin, I think is the terminology. In Waukesha, Wisconsin was granted approval. I don't know if it's followed through. I saw that as kind of the hole in the dike, the crack in the dam, and I'm just wondering if you foresee other cities and more pressure for that to increase as we go into the future.
Thank you. Getting your exercise. So Mike was asking about the Great Lakes Water Resources Compact, something that Penny and company helped support the development of. And I just want to take y'all back a few years just to understand this, because this is a really interesting story. Back in 1997, there was a firm out of Ontario called the Nova Group that proposed to take Lake Superior water and take it by tanker over to other parts of the world. And many of us at the time said, wait a minute, this is our water. You can't sell it. You can't do that. Well, it turned out they could. Nobody had thought to get a law in place to prevent public water from being shipped overseas. So the answer to that effort was to come up with this policy called the Compact, which essentially puts water conservation rules and practices into place among the Great Lakes states, and then there's a mirror agreement with the 2 Canadian provinces as well. So your question about Waukesha, which was just granted permission to take water from Lake Michigan and send it back, is not the kind of thing that typically should be allowed under the Compact, because Waukesha is partially outside of the Great Lakes drainage basin. I don't see that kind of thing happening very often, if ever again. Waukesha, there were many of us who helped to actually write the compact, and I think you can ask anybody who was part of that effort. Waukesha was already a proposal way before the official application was put in. So the fact that Waukesha got an okay to do that, and it's partially in the basin, and it has to send that water back to the Great Lakes, is not a surprise to anybody who was involved in that. I don't see that kind of thing happening very often, if not ever again. I certainly don't see it happening on a large scale. And that is because water is extremely heavy and energy intensive to move. Just pick up a gallon of it and walk around with it for a few minutes. I mean, you're going to get a good workout. Imagine trying to move millions of gallons through a pipeline, maybe even uphill, things like that. You talk to municipal water agencies, and they will tell you that their energy bill to move water, to treat water, to send it back, that's their most expensive item on their energy bill. So it's just cost prohibitive to move water great distances and in massive quantities. So I think the economics of water movement alone helps to safeguard the Great Lakes. Having said that, I've been around long enough to know, never ever think that you're safe. You always got to keep on the lookout. I'll get to you in a second here.
Hi, Brenda Linehan, a seasonal resident here, and one of those others from Illinois. You and I were talking earlier about the BP arrangement and the energy facility down there, and I was glad to hear your response to that. But I also want to say that perhaps a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7, wasn't it near us in Mundelein or Arlington Heights that they were granted the use of Lake Michigan water? It went to court, and I think it was settled in favor of that area in Illinois. So I'm wondering, because at the time I was thinking, I don't know how they can deny.
And when you say they, you're not talking about BP.
No, that was another topic you and I were talking about before, but I'm talking about the decision, I think, went in the favor of Mundelein or Arlington Heights, and they were granted access to using water from Lake Michigan. Yeah. And so I mean, it seems like, why not? Yeah. Why would it just be our communities around Lake Michigan?
Right. So Illinois operates under some slightly different rules than everybody else does, which is probably why you escape to Door County as much as you can. But Illinois operates under a consent decree that's been lodged under the U.S. Supreme Court for decades and decades and decades. That regulates how much water Illinois can take out. And Illinois is limited to 3,200 cubic feet per second of water from Lake Michigan that can be removed. The way that communities to the west of the Basin Divide can get water is if Illinois is reducing the amount of water that's otherwise being taken out. So in other words, as long as Illinois is staying under that 3,200 cubic feet per second limit, if it's doing water conservation in one way, then it can send water out in another way. Do I think that's fair? I don't. But that was the deal that was struck. Illinois, I should say, not so much Illinois, but I should say Chicago is doing some really interesting things. For example, because so many of you are from Illinois, like I am, so I don't hold it against you, McCormick Place has, just in case you were wondering by all my comments, McCormick Place has one of the largest green rooftops anywhere in the world. That water, which used to fall on top of McCormick Place, run off into a street and go into the Mississippi River, and now goes back into Lake Michigan. So there are efforts like that. They may be very localized, but water is being sent back into Lake Michigan, whereas it hadn't been before. Another thing that was done was, you know, that in Illinois we have a lot of locks. Those used to be very leaky, and some of them have been shored up, which means that not as much water is going through the Illinois River system. And that has helped. So that's a very long answer to your question, but as long as Illinois is staying under that threshold, it's allowed to do that. And that is something that's written into this compact.
I don't want to harp on Foxconn too much, but I think Foxconn represents a precedent that's well disguised, a potential precedent that's well disguised. If they tap their water through Racine and its privileges, 15.2 million gallons a day, that's a precedent that our governor and the current administration will support. So I think that we'll have a lot of plants just west of all of our shoreline towns. Now we got a real problem, and it's a very devious way of circumventing that Great Lakes Resources Compact. How long LCD TVs are going to be in the marketplace, I don't know, but we're potentially going to spend $3 billion. That's $283,000 per job to be created here. It's a farce. And so I would hope that people, business people, would look at this and say, you're not only insulting the Great Lakes Compact, but you're insulting our business intelligence. So it's well disguised.
Thank you. I have no response. I'm glad, and I'm glad you're looking, and I'm glad that you're making this known to everybody. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm Susan Marks from Sturgeon Bay, also DCEC board member. My question has to do with, I would like your comments about the fertilizer pollution that we're seeing now in Green Bay, but also in the Gulf of Mexico, which is directly an effect of the runoff from the Midwest. Knowing what we know, that phosphates are causing a lot of this, who is informing farmers as to the quantity, and is there a rule on how much you can spread per acre, and is that some way of managing this? Because if it's all running off, a lot of it's running off, what is the purpose of continually dumping more on? Is this kind of an overkill process with farming? And can we somehow connect water quality with health and food quality, milk quality, food quality, because all food and milk is provided through water sources? What are your thoughts about that?
All right, so I'll get to as many of those as I can. Under the Clean Water Act, agriculture was largely exempted from the kinds of regulations that pipes, what we call point source discharges are subject to. And so they're called non-point sources in the agricultural world. They don't have the same form of oversight. So that's an uphill battle for all of us. And that's been the way that the law has been structured for a long time. I think part of the problem is what to do with the manure. There's just so much of it that it's just gotten to the point where you can't take it somewhere else because they're already struggling in other places with the amount of manure that exists. So what do you do with it? And I think that there are two kinds of answers to that. One is keep looking for ways to reduce the amount of manure, like biodigesters, like technology. The other is the prevention side, which is, where's the demand for livestock coming from? It's coming from us. So you can work on the prevention side as well. You can only apply so much manure before it runs off. And, I kind of already touched on this notion of carrying capacity. You can only do so much before that manure just has to go somewhere. I don't think I have anything more I can add to that, except to say that some of this is state law. Some of it is, I think, local municipalities have a role to play here as well. And especially now in Kewaunee County is really ground zero for this debate, where you have competing public policy priorities. On the one hand, you want to support agriculture. On the other hand, you want to support public health. What happens when these two come into conflict? And honestly, I'm going to go back to your question. No, I'm going to go back to your question about, well, what the heck does government do? Government is charged with striking that balance, finding that way to harmonize competing public policy priorities. And here in this instance, where you don't have rules and regulations on, for the most part, on one sector, it tilts the priorities in one direction. And I think that's what you see. It's the absence of protection on one side of the equation that leads to that imbalance. I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but part of the problem we have is that basically agricultural sources of pollution, it's been one of those areas where government has not wanted to tread into. It has not wanted to dive into that area. So what can be done about it? Again, I think it's on the prevention side. You vote with your dollars. I do think that there's some very good public education efforts going on. The USDA and its Natural Resources Conservation Service has what are called discovery farms, where they will fund a farmer, a producer, to open their farm up to help educate people about how the farm does its work and what kinds of practices are best for conservation purposes. And one has just been opened in Kewaunee County. These kinds of education efforts will matter. They do matter. And I've seen some of these discovery farms at work, and they are really interesting. You can go, you can visit these places, and you can see for yourself what they do, where their challenges are. But at the end of the day, I think the approach to take is the one that you on the council are taking, which is to keep engaging in those communications. Where we get into problems is when, it's just one side against the other, and there's just this fighting. And, there are a lot of farmers who want to try to do the right thing. But some friendly pressure, along with communications, along with these discovery farms, I think can help in the long run. I got to tell you, you're asking a question that is a great question, and it's incredibly complex. And I've spent 30 years trying to figure this problem out, and I still have a really hard time doing it because it is so complex. There is no silver bullet on this one.
Are university ag programs, are they suppressing the science that we need to be discussing on this, or are they helping move us forward in this?
Yeah, our university ag programs suppressing the science on this. I think the frustration is that we're not seeing progress fast enough. It's not that we're seeing progress at all. Part of the problem is that what we call best management practices, the kinds of things that you want to see farmers do, would be put into place, but we weren't necessarily monitoring to see how well they were doing, and then use that information to help inform other producers to do the same kind of thing. That is starting to change. There's something called edge of field monitoring, where a gizmo is put at the edge of the field, just like the name suggests, and you monitor to see what things work and what don't. And over time, you get rid of the things that don't work, and where the federal government's subsidizing stuff that doesn't work, and you do more of the things that do work. And that is happening more and more and more. Look, we all run our lives that way. I'd like to think that we do, that we learn from our mistakes and we try to keep doing better. I think in the ag world that is starting to happen. Do I wish it was happening faster? Absolutely. Okay. Wow, you guys just keep coming. Look at you.
Or we can all eat less beef. It's an option. It is an option. We don't have to eat beef every day, for sure.
Jean Levitt, summer resident of Bailey's Harbor. Just my question was, the CAFOs that are in Kiwanis, are they mostly milk cows? Therefore, you want to drink less milk and eat less cheese.
We thank you very much for taking questions. I have, we keep going? Are there more questions? I've got a question. I've got the mic, so I get to ask. What we're seeing in Northeast Wisconsin is the strong influence of money in the agricultural community, greatly influencing what goes on. Specifically, the enforcement of existing regulations with big animal operations, CAFOs. Within the last 2 weeks, there's been a lawsuit, believe it or not, brought by the CAFOs against the Wisconsin DNR for what they are enforcing, which is incredible because they have greatly diminished the money that in Wisconsin that supplies the DNR. So it seems to be a money issue, and that's what I alluded to in my opening remarks. And I alluded to the answer that the consumer can make a difference. What do you think about the money and the influence of money, and how do we combat that? And this can be your last question if you'd like to stop.
Yeah, well, and I'll just stick around too. If folks want to just get going, don't worry, no offense taken. I'll stick around if people have questions. They want to just come on up, that's fine. Money in this area. I mean, that's the question that underpins everything. There was a question earlier tonight about ballast water tanks and invasive species, and that boils down to who bears the expense of trying to prevent or control the harm. In that context. In the context of the refinery in Whiting, same thing. You can ask that question about any of these issues. Thank you very much for coming tonight.